And finally, Anne Keys, Joint Managing Partner at recruitment firm The Panel. Anne will be able to give an expert view on the hiring trends that have resulted from the Dear Chair letter and what firms should consider when looking to recruit. And just before we start, I should add that viewers are encouraged to send in questions at any time, and we'll try to answer as many of those in the time that we have. So, my first question is to Michael, and given your background and your time at the central bank, can you tell us why CP86 was introduced in the first place?
Thanks, Nick. Well, first of all, I think there's a multitude of reasons why CP86 was necessary, but a big part of it was the success of the industry itself. If you look at Irish Fund's website, some of the stats that are there. In 2006, AUM for Irish domiciled funds were 728 billion. It grew to 1.3 trillion in 2013, and by the end of 2020, it stood at 3.2 trillion. But this is most definitely a success, and I think something the industry can be very proud of. However, that growth brings more scrutiny. And I think through a combination of the Central Bank of Ireland's own work and seeing some large firms with minimum resourcing, a number of individuals with excessive directorships, and questions being raised internationally at the size of the industry, it was clear that a more robust regime for fund management companies was needed. Fund management companies were also outliers in the central bank's own regulatory sphere, in that quite a number of fund management companies had no locally based staff. And this was always going to change. If you think about post-financial crisis, the banks and insurers took precedence. But by 2015, 2016, the central bank was most definitely turning its attention to fund management companies. I do, though, think it is important to note that the central bank, and us who were taking part in the conversation, recognised that the industry needed to be able to demonstrate that it had in place strong governance and oversight arrangements to protect itself and its continued growth. I think everyone could recognise that any adverse finding from any peer review could have resulted in not an ideal outcome for the industry. So I think it strikes me that the ability to be able to delegate investment management is critically important to the industry in Ireland, and protecting that should be a priority. And so by demonstrating that a firm has robust governance and oversight arrangements with enough and suitably qualified staff in the jurisdiction goes a long way to achieving this.
Yeah, I see. And with the Dear Chair letter that the central bank published, what was the purpose of that? And were you surprised at the contents?
So I think that the Dear Chair letter kind of follows a well-trodden path with the central bank, where after it carries out any body of work, it tries to communicate back to industry what it has seen, both good practices and obviously poor practices. I think that's the main purpose of the Dear Chair letter, to give that information to as wide an audience as possible. Was I surprised? I think broadly speaking, no. There was no real surprises for me in the letter, maybe with the exception of the locally based comments. I think on the initial reading, it could have been interpreted that all DPs needed to be based in Ireland. However, I think that's been clarified at this stage with the language or letter from the bank saying that only preponderance needs to be in Ireland. I think that gives sufficient flexibility that you can have DPs in other jurisdictions. If I'm being honest, I don't see how anyone could have been surprised. And the bank have been clearly signposted what were its main concerns over the previous couple of years in speeches, how they were dealing with Brexit applications, and not to say the various comments and communications coming out of the EU, particularly from ESMA. I think anyone who would have read the Brexit opinions would have quite clearly seen the 3 FTE number. While there was some flexibility in the additional scrutiny comments, I think once that number got into any sort of documentation, I think the kind of writing was on the wall, if I use that type of phraseology. I do appreciate, though, that maybe for the likes of SMICs, they may have been a little bit unclear on where they were at. I think the bank may not have been as pointed in calling these out, but I would also say the bank didn't give any comfort that SMICs would be treated any differently than Mancos. So from a commercial perspective, well, I think I can understand, and I think lots of us understand kind of the wait and see tactic. I think it's quite clear now what the expectations are from the central bank, and for all firms, including the SMICs, I think the need to be able to demonstrate what their plans are, now needs to become a priority for all firms on their boards.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Michael, and I'm sure we'll come back to exactly what the definition definition of preponderance is. But, Declan, maybe you could just give us an idea from your perspective what the industry's reaction was to the letter, and maybe an idea of some of the international dynamics that were behind the whole sort of framework.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nick. And I think Michael has kind of set the scene slightly well in this regard, that generally I don't think there was any surprises really from industry that, as Michael said, the bank had been signalling this in speeches and conferences over the past 18 months and during the period of their review. Also, I think those firms that have gone through the authorization process in the last 18 months or so, or made changes to the programs of activities, designated persons, would have experienced the central bank being more definitive as to their expectations. So, well, those firms that may have been authorized for a number of years wouldn't have had the need to revisit their programs of activities or change roles, wouldn't perhaps have had the direct experience of the central bank's expectations. I think industry would generally have been aware that the requirements were evolving. With respect to specific comments and questions, I think when the Dear Chair letter was published, the two areas that were most of focus was whether the 3 FTEs was a hard minimum for SMICs in particular, and also, as Michael had said, the comment with respect to whether all DP roles needed to be in the jurisdiction. And again, we had an exchange with the central bank and they subsequently clarified those 2 points. So with respect to the international aspects of it then, again, as Michael has said, I think this has been kind of the direction of travel. I think certainly in the past few years, we've seen more of a focus in European supervisors and policymakers looking at where activities are undertaken, possibly accelerated by Brexit, and certainly the extent to which investment management activity could be undertaken from the UK post-Brexit certainly focused the debate and the discussions. And in particular, I think maybe 2-3 years ago now, we saw the proposed reform of the European securities authorities, which during the course of that European proposal saw suggestions that ESMA would actually have a role in pre-approving activities that might be delegated outside the EU. So again, this discussion has been in the ether, while the ESA reforms didn't conclude with respect to the role proposed by ESMA, it clearly hasn't gone away.
Yeah. So do you think it's fair to say that it's been a European-wide trend that is being accelerated by Brexit? It's not necessarily an island being picked out for anything.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it is. And again, it's just caused policymakers to think about are they overly exposed to a third country? A term that's come up recently has been strategic autonomy, and whether there's infrastructure or expertise that is located outside the EU that could put the EU under pressure in times of stress. Certainly our view is the regime we have here, it puts a good governance overlay on delegation and has served us well. There are many jurisdictions there are some that would see that as gold plating. We would say it supports the delegation model, and I think hopefully will position us well for the debate that's coming on AIFMD.
Sure. And I guess the main point of the discussion today is to look at what the action plan is, what the key sort of parts of that are. So, Owen, if I can turn to you, what would you say is sort of the key requirement for people's action plan, which, as I understand, there's a deadline of March the 31st to get those action plans in. Is that correct?
That's correct. I think there's two main asks in the letter, or two deadlines. One is the 3 FTE minimum. The second is to have a plan in place by the 31st of March. I think what we have seen from talking to both our clients and prospects, a lot of the reconnaissance of what option would I go for? Will I put in my own management company? Will I go third party? Will I go full infrastructure? Or worst case, would I exit the domicile? That reconnaissance really commenced the start of November and was largely concluded in January. And we now see many prospects putting their plans together because the board reports need to be done by the end of February in order to be disseminated to the board for passing. There isn't a requirement, or there isn't a deadline, I should say, as to when that plan must be executed by. But I think there is a natural expectation that it should be concluded by the end of this year. There will be another review done next year, so it is advisable for all firms to have their plan concluded by the end of this year. I think it's worth saying that I think that was a smart play in that to have the plan in place, because a plan is a plan and a plan may go through iterations. But I think it's important to have a baseline plan ready for March, and as you go through the execution phases of that, you may pivot a little in how you do that. You might opt for a full platform rather than a third party because you might not like that as you go through that, as an example. So I think that's the piece that's really playing out now. Plus, I guess Anne will give us the insight into the recruitment side of how we would put in your own management company and the challenges that go with that. So that really is the lay of the land right now. Plan must be done by the 31st of March. Arguably, it is a second board meeting for many boards, as they would have had board meetings in plan for April when they were filing their financial statements. So I think there is a burden on boards to fit all of that in. I think that will lead to expedient board meetings, which means that the plans and the memos to the board will be very exacting and very prepared.
I see. And I mean, Declan, you mentioned the clarity, some extra clarity was given around the FTE requirement. But are there any areas at the moment where clients or member firms are still sort of unclear or see any ambiguity?
They would desire ambiguity, healthful ambiguity, maybe, Nick. But no, to be honest, they were the two, I think, big ticket issues. I think what is encouraging is in recent weeks, people have been approaching me in exchange with respect to implementation plans and how kind of the implementation issues that might arise in consideration. So I think that's encouraging. I think certainly, again, the central bank kind of do need firms to move. I think, and then when you look at the spectrum of entities you have in the jurisdiction, from SMICs to fully staffed management companies, there's different lengths of travel for each of these entities. So again, if those that have further to go maybe will need the full year, or the end of the year might be a reasonable deadline. Those with shorter to travel, the bank might expect a shorter time frame and period to complete their plans. But I think in the first instance, if the central bank are seeing momentum and movement, I would hope that they'll be pragmatic with industry. But again, it's not a case that they want to, you have a plan and you can put it in the drawer. They will be asking about implementation, and even with respect to some RMPs that issued following this, I think the central bank were looking for sign-off by third parties, and we're meeting boards to talk about the action plan. So again, I think to Owen's point, in general, if you're looking to have them implemented by the end of the year, that probably makes sense.
I'd probably add that there's a few parts to the letter, in that a lot of the plans will focus on the resourcing component and the policies and procedures and the various shortcomings of how the management company itself is run. But there are sideline observations in the letter outside the performance of the management company, notably the commentary on the Organizational Effectiveness Director. So there now has been a shift of focus of getting the plan done for the resourcing and the policies and procedures to how do I do my organizational effectiveness role? Am I doing it correctly? Is there more I need to do? And in the recent weeks, we have also seen some movement on how do I assess my diversity of my board, and also the tenure of my board, and we have noted one or two INEDs have put their hands up to say, actually, my tenure on this board is more than 10 years, and therefore I will put a plan in front of the board to transition through that, which I think is very magnanimous of the individuals and should be applauded. But I think it's been interesting to see the phases of the letter start with what do we need to do to sort out the management company, plus then there are 2 or 3 other things in the letter that we need to cycle our way through.
Yeah, I think you're right, Owen. Again, the governance, and certainly what we've seen on many instances over the recent years, is the central bank look for evidence. So again, I think to look at the Dear Chair letter, it's not just about substance and activities, it's governance is permeates it as well. So to look at how you structure, how you document your procedures and all of that.
Sure, I'm sure we'll return to some of those points in today's discussion, but I want to turn now just to resources and staffing, and I guess the human side of the substance. So, Anne, from your perspective as a recruiter, what roles are most in demand as a result of CP86?
Yeah, I suppose, just to say that obviously there's been a flurry of recruitment activity since the issuing of the Dear Chair letter. And there's no surprise then that, the roles in the biggest demand are the DP functions, which are obviously compliance, investment risk, operational risk, investment management, distribution, and capital and financial management. And of those roles, it's really the governance roles that are in the biggest demand. So that's compliance, investment risk, and operational risk. And then in addition to that, we're seeing, an increase in country head roles, support functions to designated persons, an increase in demand for legal people, and also independent non-exec directors.
I see. And is there any sign of a potential skill shortage? Are all these roles being adequately filled?
I suppose in terms of the skill shortage or just even where the market's at, I mean, the roles that have been registered have been filled. And I think that's a really positive sign in terms of anyone looking to hire. Now, I suppose I'd caveat that a little bit to say that, we have to manage clients' expectations in the number of CVs they're going to get for certain roles, particularly for governance roles. And also, some roles are taking longer than others to fill. And on average, time to hire is anywhere shortish 4 months, probably on average is about 6. And there is going to be a flurry of activity in terms and a real push to hire experienced designated persons, because in the letter, one of the failings, in inverted commas, is that firms are not hiring senior enough designated persons. So I think there's going to be a run on designated persons. I think a lot of firms are looking to see, have they got the right level of experience. I can definitely see that there'll be potential war in talent, particularly in the governance area, and and I suppose some of the let's say reaction to that would be that are positive is that some of the educational institutes are looking to put together courses, maybe designated person transition courses that we've got a good talent pool in terms of the funds admin business, and and clients are not looking at that talent pool. They only are looking for candidates in investment management or who've experience in investment management, Manco, Super Manco. But there's another world out there that actually deal with investment managers, and we need to be able to transition those candidates across, and there'll be a much bigger tool, or should I say talent pool, for candidates. There's a lot of, you have to attract the right people, so there's a huge competition in terms of talent. Retaining people, you have to really wrap your arms around your governance people, and you really need to sell yourself well to candidates, because they've got lots of different choices, and that's down to your name, your assets under management, your culture, but also particularly your commitment to Ireland. And up to now, obviously some clients did the bare minimum, and now they have to do a lot more. But if the client sees Ireland as a real integral part of their overall group, they'll attract the best talent. But it is going to be tough, and there is going to be a real war for very good people.
And given that sort of war for people, and you raised the issue of seniority, the Dear Chair letter also mentions diversity. So is that going to be a sort of a secondary concern, or will the industry be able to address, I guess, is there enough diversity there, and will they be able to address diversity as well as seniority?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Nick. I know, just to give you some stats, let's say, the central bank issued a report last year on the demographics in the financial services sector, and that looked across banking, payments, funds, and asset management. And just to highlight stats, men, and they looked at, let's say, PCF roles within the financial services sector. So currently, or up to the end of 2019, men held 87% of PCF roles in asset management. 85% of revenue generating positions and 75% of risk and control roles were held by men. So, already we see that there is a lack of diversity in senior positions. I think in Ireland, diversity tends to mean gender first, and then how diverse your organisation is really down to how many men and women you have in the organisation. I think because of the pressure that companies are under to hire, probably the first focus will be to get the right person. Diversity is definitely a big focus for firms coming in, and I see that in terms of diversity policies. But I suppose for some roles you won't get a diverse slate. And my job as someone who runs a recruitment firm and who's co-vice chair of 100 Women in Finance, I know there's a responsibility there for me to find and to provide a diverse candidate slate. But at the same time, I need my clients, and I need to let them know about to be realistic about the talent pool in Ireland, to educate them about the market, and also to manage expectations. I think when it comes to diversity, it's much broader than gender, and we know that. I think you can certainly, look at diversity as a whole in terms of your team, and not just focus on diversity in a particular role, because you may not get that diverse slate. But if you look at diversity, and if you're hiring 6, 7, 8 people, then maybe look at hiring, look at the whole group, and you will probably find you will get more diverse candidates, maybe at the more junior to mid-level, let's say. But that is something that I think the industry, we have to work on more, and we need to focus on it to build up that diverse slate.
Sure, and again, this is something that Michael might be able to add to as well. But the CBI or the central bank has the right to reject appointments. So. Are firms always aware of this, and do you have any advice for them in how they sort of manage that approval process? Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Do you know whether you want me to talk first and then move to Michael?
Sorry, yes, and then maybe Michael might have some anecdotes from his time at the central bank.
Sure. So I suppose, when I'm working with clients, I do obviously highlight the fact that it's detrimental to candidates' career if they're rejected by the central bank. And, so when they're hiring for designated persons, they have to take that into account. And they, and the letter specifically states that they want to see more experienced designated persons. So up to now, they're not seeing that, and some of the clients have hired in candidates who are just too junior. So really, when they're hiring candidates, they need to take into consideration the years of experience that the candidate has. They also need to look at how this individual is going to challenge delegates. They're also seen, like designated persons are seen as the senior management team in an FMC. So would you see them as a senior management person? And also, will they get past an interview with the central bank? So, there's a lot of considerations for clients and also for candidates. So our job also is to highlight to candidates that when they take on, a designated person or PCF role, they're going to be held personally responsible. They're also going to have personal liability and be personally accountable. And that's a lot to take if you're a mid-level candidate. So I think Michael will be able to add to that, coming from from a central bank, previous central bank career.
Sure. So yes, Michael.
Sorry, thanks, Anne. Sorry, Nick. Yeah, so I think what I'd say, but clearly the responsibility for recruitment rests with the firm itself. But we all know that the central bank, obviously, does scrutinise every PCF application. And while Anne says it's would be detrimental to the career of an individual, I would also say it's highly embarrassing to a firm if they put forward a candidate who was not at the right level. So I think it really is important to get that right. And I think if you think about it from the central bank's perspective, perspective, at the authorization stage, including approving someone into a role, is when they have greatest power. In other words, they want to make sure that they are facing off against the right type of person in the individual regulated entity, and obviously that is the right person who's able to manage or run the particular area that they're responsible for. So it's a critically important point in time in a firm's life when they are either appointing for the first time or renewing the particular PCFs.
Sure. And sorry, we've got an audience question just while we're on the subject of resourcing that I think could be quite relevant. And it says, on the point of diversity, does the requirement for fund board directors to be Irish residents pose a challenge to achieving this? So I don't know if everybody has an opinion on this.
I can say I don't get the sense that it's a challenge at the moment. I think we've got good diversity pool with respect to boards in particular. So certainly not at the moment. I don't foresee it. I think there's a pipeline there that could fill any pinch points.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well, Declan. I think there's a really good, particularly when you talk about diversity from a gender perspective. There's a lot of very experienced female candidates available and have moved into the space of INEDs actually in the last 2 years. So I think the pipeline is very good.
And on the subject of INEDs, as a relatively fresh INED, Michael, what are your expectations in what you're looking for from a firm if you're going to be one of their independent non-executive directors?
Yeah, so I think for me personally, I do not underestimate the responsibilities that are placed on directors, whether you're an INED or an executive director. So I think from my own perspective, I would want to see that the firm basically has resources in Ireland. I'd also want to see that they have a strong CEO and second line staff. So in reality, they've kind of embraced the central bank's expectations on CP86. And the logic behind it for me is that the personal risk to one's reputation and also potentially future roles of being associated with a firm that has not are just, for me, too great. I think we should also recognise that while it's not in place yet, but the senior executive and accountability regime will be in place at some stage for the asset management area. And that in itself is going to place even greater personal risk and personal responsibility, whatever way we want to describe it, onto individuals, including individuals who take up roles as independent non-executive directors. So I think it's important that as directors, you can have confidence and you can see and look in the eyes those individuals who are responsible for the day-to-day running of the entity. Because as a director, you are not responsible on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I see. And so I just, before we get to some of more of the audience questions, I just want to ask everyone what they see, particularly Declan and Owen, what they see as the wider impact on Ireland as a result of CP86. I guess the first question is, will we see firms, particularly the smaller ones and the self-managed firms, leave Ireland as a result of these requirements?
Yeah, I don't think so, Nick. I suspect what we'll probably see is a good number of self-managed investment companies move to third-party providers, and those with multiple fund ranges or large fund ranges who will establish their own fund management company. With respect to leaving Ireland, I think any entity that leaves Ireland will probably leave Europe. That I don't see any European standard being any different to what would be expected here. If they did go to another European jurisdiction, I don't think that would be that would stand the test of time. As I see a move towards more harmonisation.
Yeah, I'd agree with Declan. When we ran our analysis, we came up with 5 options. One was to leave the domicile, but you would have to go to a non-ESMA related domicile, because no matter what way you cut this, I think Ireland is ahead of other jurisdictions with CP86 in its framework. So moving to another ESMA domicile, you're only kicking the can down the road, really. And secondly, it is entirely likely that your investor base wants that European domicile fund for whatever purposes they have in terms of the taxation or look-through, etc. The other options that are there are for like-minded managers to merge or acquire each other. Then there's the third-party route, a full infrastructure route, where you resign yourself to being the portfolio manager while somebody else takes the regulatory burden of running the funds. And then the last one is that you would put in your own management company, but that one is fraught with challenge, namely on resourcing. If you're a big brand, as Declan alludes to, you will have no issue attracting staff because you're a household name and will have pulling power in that regard. If you're a mid-tier or a lower-tier firm, with the greatest of respect, I think you'll struggle to hire people. And even if you do, they may well be repurposed staff out of admins, depots, audit firms, law firms, and so forth. But when they have their 2 or 3 years experience, they're a very valuable commodity right now. So I do see the small and the mid-tier migrating more towards third-party management solution or full infrastructure, and the larger firms may well choose to put in their own management company. And the last point I probably should make is that this isn't just about SMICs either. There's many management companies in Ireland. There's approximately 350, 100 of which are post-Jan 18 or Brexit applications. So the 250 that predate that, a large number of those have the same substance issues as SMICs. So they may well fold their management companies and transfer to a third party or an infrastructure solution also.
I see. And again, a question for everyone. Do you think if there is more substance and a year on when everyone's implemented their plan, that the landscape of Ireland's funds industry will change? It will be less of a sort of a servicing centre and maybe more front office based, more actual fund managers here?
Well,
I have different answers around the table on that. I think the landscape has changed dramatically in the last 2 years anyway, in that a lot of the new careers have been roles in fund management companies by virtue of the 100 applications that have come in. Front office, that's an interesting one. I think that CP86 is a very enabling framework to achieve delegation of portfolio management. And the reality is that the best portfolio manager for whatever strategy is probably currently in the right country to do that. If you didn't have delegation and forced those managers to be in country, you're not going to get the best of the best in that particular strategy. So I think delegation of portfolio management is always has a need to be sacrosanct. So while I think there will be opportunities in front office, it may not be in very specific niche areas. I think those need to stay where they are to the best interest of the investor, not to anybody else. But so that's what I would see.
Yeah. I think there's been an evolution on even I think the distance between back, middle and front office has probably shortened. So again, and to some of the points that Anne made earlier as well, we now have kind of a mature fund servicing domicile, fund servicing centre, very familiar with dealing with investors, dealing with managers. So I think there's the history and background kind of complements the evolution to closer to front office, but I'm not suggesting we'll be the London of the future.
Mm. And just on that point as well, what we find is, the firms that have come in, they're in setup mode, and only some of them are just moving into BAU. And we've seen other managers that came in, 10, 15 years ago, like Amundi and, BlackRock, where they started small. And then I suppose what we find is that the talent pool, they realise that we have a very strong talent pool. And one of the things that I think is important to mention is, Ireland is really good at attracting its people back home. I mean, the Irish, are all over the world, and they're now seeing Ireland as a really good place to come back to because of the big names that we're attracting here. And we're also attracting international candidates to Ireland and candidates with an Irish connection. So while we might start off small now, where we 5 to 30 people in the sector, I mean, our job is to show that we can do a lot more than maybe the oversight role, and we've proved that in other in other managers that have come here. And I also hear from managers that I'm working with and clients that they do plan to expand and evolve their operations. So I think we just need to be ready for that. And we tend to be a very agile talent pool anyway. So I think what we see now, but what we'll see in 5 to 10 years might be, a very interesting industry and another evolution in terms of the financial services sector.
Sure. We've got about 10 minutes left and we're getting a lot of audience questions in, so I want to try and get to as many of them as I can. And one of them you mentioned sort of talent pool, and one question is, does this create a risk of rising costs if this talent pool becomes, I guess, sort of too intense? So is that an issue that has to be managed?
Absolutely. I think if you're in an investment manager or a manco, super manco, if you're being extracted out of them for roles, you're going to get you're going to get an average 20% increase on your basic, maybe higher, depending on the area that you're recruiting in or the area that the skill set you want. I think if clients are creative, they'll start looking at the broader talent pool. I mean, I've got candidates who give their right arm to get into a DP role. They've got all the right skills. It's just that the clients at the moment won't look at them. So I think that if you look at the broader talent pool, you'll actually get better value candidates with very good skills that can easily transition over. So I am very focused on being creative in terms of how you hire. But if firms continue to go after the same people, they're going to push up salaries.
I see. And Michael, I've got a question specifically for you. Can you clarify whether DPs are in fact accountable if something goes wrong? And I guess that I'm not quite sure what it is that goes wrong, but where will that accountability come from? And I guess you do not have fiduciary duties equivalent to fund or manco directors.
So the way I'd answer that is that I would view the DP as the executive function, no different than the executive function in any other firm. So if something goes wrong under your watch, how do you define accountability? So you will face some sort of consequences. But if I take it the next stage, if clearly something significant goes wrong and you were the one who was responsible for an area, it is going to impact on your future career, irrespective of what inverted commas accountability you have. Plus also, when we do see SEER come in, you will find that there will be more formalized accountability placed on not just DPs, but also executives in all financial services firms, similar that you have in the senior manager regime in the UK. So I think, it's, the word accountability is a kind of a hard one to judge. There may not be a fiduciary responsibility, but I'd like to think that everyone who operates in a senior role in any entity feels a high level of accountability and should be held if they don't achieve what's expected of them.
Which would also percolate up to whoever the PCF8 is, I think.
And another great question here actually is, I guess, to do with the rate of approval for manco applications. Is there any concern that applications, whether that be in-house or via third party, may not be finalised in time for implementation by a year-end deadline? Maybe Owen, you'd be a good one for that. Is there any concern about the approval process and deadlines?
Approval of the plan, I think, is that the question?
I think it's the where you're applying to appoint a manco, whether that yeah.
Nick, if you want, I could jump in there actually, Nick. I think I might have an answer that that's okay. So the way I look at it, I know Owen says that there might be an expectation for everything to be done by the end of this year, but I think it's fair to say if your plan envisages you setting up a manco, I think the central bank would recognise that you will not have a manco set up by 31st of December 21. So what the central bank would expect is, one, you have to plan, two, it's a reasonable plan, and three, during the year you are doing your best to implement it. And if that means that you're not fully finalised till some stage in 2022, not the end of 2022, I think you will find the central bank would accept that. So it doesn't have to happen by the end of the year, but you most definitely have to have a well thought out, well considered, reasonable plan. I think the firms will find the central bank having a certain level.
As long as you didn't start in December, right? I think honesty of endeavour through the next period of time is what will be reflected on in that tolerance. Yeah, I agree.
Exactly. Absolutely.
So, I mean, is it important then, I guess, what capacity is there to be constantly engaged with the central bank during the year if your plan changes, maybe from what you put in March? Is that important to do? And I guess, is it possible to do to engage with the central bank?
Well, maybe Nick, I can take that. And my experience with the central bank, and particularly in recent months, has been they're very open for firms to engage with them and approach them with questions or queries. Again, to bear in mind, they need firms to move, and they need firms to move to kind of this new world, and they want to help and encourage them to do that. So they've been very clear that they have no issue in taking any questions or queries from industry once industry is moving forward.
I see, and we've got another question here. It talks about are there any roles that can be combined with the CP86 listed DP? So, for example, operational risk roles and fund management roles. And I guess, Owen, on a wider point, you talked earlier about duplication, so duplication of effort, and whether that's buying into the philosophy behind CP86. So I know you have quite a sort of a strong view on what duplicative means, and I guess following the spirit of CP86.
Yeah, I think on the duplication thing, I think we have heard from certain clients and prospects that they view the requirement to have some of these resources in country as being duplicative, right? I think the point of CP86, though, is that role is meant to be in country already. So if it's being duplicative, you're actually doing the work in the wrong place. It is possible to combine certain DP roles. It's done more the other side, in that you can't have fund risk management and investment management combined, and there's a couple of permutations there. So it's possible to do it. And I think equally the letter has been, very pragmatic in being laid out as 3 FTE as opposed to 3 people. So 3 FTE can be done by a number of people. But the duplication point really, I think, is if you're putting people in to establish your own presence, then the smart play is to have that work done by those people as the primary originator, because that's what the role is meant to be doing, as opposed to overseeing a role and duplicating the effort. So that's how I would answer that.
I see. Okay, well, we're coming very much to the end. So I guess as a final comment from everyone, what would be your biggest priority in terms of an action plan? What is you think the number one thing to consider how your action plan should be sort of coming to fruition? So maybe, Michael, if we can start with you.
It may sound simple, but have a plan. In other words, spend the time now making sure you have a plan in place and it's well thought out, and it has strong reason to pass muster with the central bank. And
Declan.
Following on Michael's, I suppose, I think there's something for everyone in the Dear Chair letter. So it's not just about substance, not just about location. And one thing maybe I'd mention is diversity, board composition. Don't forget about that.
Anne?
I suppose my one would be, just not to delay when it comes to hiring. The first of the market will get the best talent available. So I would say you kick off your hiring process if you know you have to increase resources to kick that off as soon as possible.
And finally, Owen.
Mine would be similar to Anne's. It would be, you need to start moving fast, and you need to move now, because regardless of your preference, you may not get that if you're in a queue. So the herd is already starting to move. And if you want your preferred solution, I think you need to start executing that now, because you may be left with a choice that isn't your preference, that you may have to take on.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank everyone. I'd like to thank the audience. We got lots of questions that we weren't quite able to answer in the but we'll try and follow up where possible. And also there'll be a full write-up of this webinar in the magazine, and the recording of the webinar will be on our website. So thanks again. I'd like to thank Anne, Declan, Owen and Michael, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.